rights come from. For a long time, it was assumed that the idea of rights just sort of spontaneously emerged somewhere around the 17th century, give or take. That was the standard view. All of a sudden, people thought of the idea of rights. That is no longer a sustainable view. And once again, modern scholars, believe it or not, are coming to the defense of the church and showing that, in fact, the idea of rights is not confined to the 17th century. It goes all the way back to the 12th century, where we see the language of rights beginning. Now that's interesting, but before we get into that any further, I think I should address some, discomfort that Catholics may sometimes have with the concept of rights. Because I think today we live in a culture in which everybody claims that anything he wants to do is a right. I have the right to do this, the right to do that. It almost makes rights language seem empty or even dangerous. So I simply want to clarify, a right simply means that you possess a kind of immunity from invasion. If I have a right to life, it means that it would be wrong for you to invade my life violently. That's all that means. It's a kind of immunity I have against aggression. That, in effect, is what a right is. Now, what interests us particularly is the concept of natural rights. A natural right is a right that you have because you're a human being. By nature, you enjoy this right. So a natural right is not given to you by a government. It's something you possess by virtue of being a human being. And it's a good thing that natural rights are not given to you by government, because what governments give, governments can take away. So the concept of natural rights is what really matters. And the reason that the concept of natural rights can be born in the 12th century is that that was a culture in which the language of rights was already very prevalent. And so the concept of natural rights had fertile soil in which to grow. For example, in the late 11th century, popes and kings were having a war of words in the investiture controversy. Who's allowed to appoint and install bishops? Well, popes would speak about their rights, and kings would speak about their rights. Lords and vassals in feudal Europe, they have rights and obligations. Medieval towns had rights against the king. So, in fact, the concept of rights is embedded deeply in the 12th century. But what develops out of it is the concept of natural rights. Now, how is that different? The right I have as a pope to install bishops is not a natural right. Not all human beings have the right to install bishops. That's a right you have as a pope. A natural right is a right that everybody possesses by virtue of being human. But people who are constantly thinking about rights, the rights of the pope, the rights of the king, the rights of the lords, the rights of the vassals, the rights of the medieval town, well, these are people who are going to start thinking, aren't there just rights that human beings possess because they're human beings? And we start to see from about 1150 to 1300, this crucial period, is where we really begin to see the concept of natural rights blossom. So this came out of the heart of the church. This wasn't developed by the church's enemies. The church was way, way ahead of everybody on the concept of rights. But now let's take this idea and develop it even further, because we're going to be coming back from the break in a minute. We're going to talk more about why natural rights are so important and the church's role. So come on back and join me. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today we're talking about law and rights. And we've seen so far that the Church gave Western Europe its first modern legal system with its canon law. There was nothing like that up to that time. And then beyond that, it's the Church and her canon lawyers, her church lawyers, who begin to introduce the concept of natural rights, which means that human beings, simply because they are human beings, are endowed with certain rights. That is to say, they are endowed with certain immunities so that they cannot be invaded or aggressed against in these areas of their lives. Now, just before the break, I emphasized in particular the crucial period from about 1150 to 1300, when you begin to see church lawyers starting to think of all kinds of areas of life as possessing natural rights to them. For example, the right to property, the right to defend yourself in self-defense, and also to defend yourself in a court of law, and so on and on, much, much more as well. All these things were beginning to be viewed as natural rights that trumped the claims of governments. In fact, as recently as Pope Leo XIII's encyclical, Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII said that the right to property is sacred and inviolable. And that, in effect, means that nobody's allowed to interfere with your enjoyment of your property. And then in other cases, we're talking about the enjoyment of your life or the enjoyment of other rights. But these are things that you enjoy because you're a human being, and that no government can take away. You have these things before government even comes along into the picture. Now, this is a very important idea. It's a central concept in Western civilization. And these are universal rights. They're not rights that are enjoyed just by European human beings, but by all human beings. And they're not rights that are enjoyed only by Catholics, members of the faithful in the state of grace, but these are rights that are enjoyed by all people, regardless of what faith they profess. Now, it's interesting to note that in the 13th century, there had really begun to develop a very exaggerated understanding of the Pope's authority. That it was argued that the Pope, because he was the vicar of Christ on earth, in effect owned everything. And individuals enjoyed their possessions only because he allowed them to. And in the 13th century, Pope Innocent IV specifically renounced this view and said no. He said ownership, possession, and jurisdiction can belong to non-Catholics as well. Because the original argument was that the Pope owns everything and he lets Catholics enjoy property, but he has the right to deprive others of property. And Pope Innocent IV said this is complete nonsense. Catholics and non-Catholics alike, regardless of what the Pope believes about them or wants to do, can own their own property, because all rational creatures were intended to have the right to property. So this concept of rights begins to develop over the centuries, beginning with 1150 to 1300, and it reaches its height and its culmination with people we call the late scholastics, people in the 16th and 17th centuries. And in particular, the scholastics who were teaching at Spanish universities, and I mentioned before the University of Salamanca, they taught that not only do Europeans and not only do Catholics have these rights, and not only do non-Europeans and non-Catholics have these rights, but also peoples we've never heard of before. The natives of the New World, we're just meeting for the first time. Those people have the same rights to property and rights to life and rights to self-government that we have in Europe. And that's an astonishing claim, because if you look at the history of the interaction of peoples who are different from each other, you don't really see a whole lot of examples of foreign people saying to each other, oh, you have the same rights I have, because we all have a rational nature and we're made in the image and likeness of God, and so we're all equal and we have natural rights. Of course you don't see that. You don't see that at all. But this is the liberating idea that the Catholic Church brings into the world, that people all enjoy these natural rights equally. Now, that's long before John Locke talks about natural rights. He's writing in the late 1600s. This is the 12th century. That's a major contribution by the Catholic Church. Well, finally for today, my last segment involves an aspect of Western law that has been almost completely forgotten, but that thanks to Harold Berman, whose book I earnestly recommend, Law and Revolution, it's been resurrected. And what Berman tells us in his book is that if you look at the history of Western law, it is deeply informed by religious conviction and belief and religious ideas. And he says that if you really want to understand Western law, you have